Imagine waking up on a thin straw mattress in a room so dark you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and something sharper underneath it, something chemical. Around you, dozens of people are packed into a space designed for maybe half that number. Some are sleeping, some are muttering, some are screaming. And you have no idea how you got here. That is not a scene from a horror movie. That was a Tuesday night in a Victorian asylum. And if you think you could handle it, that you could keep your composure, stay calm, and wait for morning, you are wrong. Because the morning was worse. The story of Victorian asylums is one of those rare historical chapters where the reality is actually more disturbing than the myth. These were not just spooky buildings on hilltops. They were functioning institutions, backed by the government, staffed by doctors, and filled with thousands of people who, in many cases, had done absolutely nothing wrong. So how did places designed to heal the mentally ill become some of the most nightmarish environments in modern history? It started, believe it or not, with kindness. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, a wave of reform swept through England and the United States. Religious groups like the Quakers looked at how society was treating people with mental illness and were horrified. Before asylums existed in any organized way, people who were deemed insane were thrown into prisons, chained in cellars, or locked in attics by their own families. Some were beaten, some were starved. Some were subjected to treatments that would make your skin crawl, including bloodletting, purging, and trepanation, which involved drilling holes directly into the skull to supposedly relieve pressure on the brain. This was a practice dating back to prehistoric times, and it was still being used in various forms well into the modern era. There was no system, no oversight, and no real attempt at understanding what was happening inside these people's minds. The Quakers wanted to change that. In 1796, a man named William Tuke founded the York Retreat in England. The idea was radical for its time. Treat patients with dignity. Give them clean rooms, fresh air, and meaningful activities. No chains, no beatings. Think of them as guests, not prisoners. And for a while, it worked. Recovery rates at these early, small-scale retreats were impressive. Doctors across England took notice, and by the 1840s, the British government was building large public asylums based on these same principles. They called it moral treatment, and the optimism around it was enormous. But moral treatment had a fatal design flaw. It only worked when the numbers were small. A retreat housing 50 patients could offer personalized care. A county asylum housing 500 could not. And the numbers did not stay small for long. By the middle of the 1800s, industrialization was packing cities with workers, poverty was spreading, and the definition of who counted as insane kept expanding. Asylums that were built to hold a few hundred patients were suddenly crammed with over 1,000. Colney Hatch Asylum in London, one of the largest in Europe, when it opened in 1851, eventually swelled into a small, overcrowded town. The staff could not keep up, the funding did not follow, and the gentle, personalized approach that made moral treatment successful became physically impossible to maintain. And it was not just the patient numbers that changed. The entire culture inside these institutions shifted. Early asylums had been deliberately built in the countryside, surrounded by gardens and farmland. The architecture itself was supposed to be therapeutic. Wide corridors, high ceilings, natural light flooding through tall windows. Patients were encouraged to walk the grounds, tend gardens, read books, even play musical instruments. Some asylums had their own libraries, concert halls, and cricket clubs. At Broadmoor in England, patients wrote letters home, describing a reasonably pleasant daily life, with sports, music, and regular conversation with other patients. But as the population swelled past anything the buildings were designed to handle, all of that disappeared. The gardens became overflow space. The concert halls became dormitories. The wide corridors filled with makeshift beds. The staff who had once focused on individual care were now simply trying to keep hundreds of people from hurting themselves or each other. And a single doctor, sometimes the only physician in the entire facility, might be responsible for 400, 500, even 600 patients at a time. That is the world you would be stepping into. Not the early optimistic version, the later one. The one where good intentions had been crushed under the weight of impossible numbers. So let us walk through what your first night would actually look like. You arrive at the asylum, probably by horse-drawn carriage, possibly escorted by a police officer or a parish official. You are taken to an intake room where a doctor examines you. And when I say examines, I mean he glances at you, asks a few questions, and writes down a diagnosis. The whole process might take 10 minutes, maybe less. One doctor at Blackwell Island Asylum in New York was responsible for evaluating hundreds of patients. He barely had time to look at them, let alone conduct anything resembling a thorough examination. After your diagnosis, they strip you of your clothes. Everything you came in with is taken away. Your personal belongings, your shoes, your identity. You are handed a thin institutional uniform, often just a rough cotton gown, and given a number. From this point forward, that number is who you are. Then comes the bath. If you are lucky, the water is warm and the attendant is gentle. But by the later decades of the Victorian era, baths had become less about hygiene and more about control. Cold water was used to subdue patients who were considered too excitable or too difficult. And cold does not begin to describe it. Attendants would force patients into tubs of near-freezing water, sometimes holding them under, while buckets of ice-cold water were poured over their heads. One account describes patients being submerged in small ponds, using chairs rigged for the purpose, held underwater until they were on the verge of losing consciousness, then pulled out and allowed to recover before being dunked again. This could go on for hours. After your bath, still shivering, still disoriented, you are taken to your ward. If you are wealthy, if your family is paying for private care, you might get a small room with a proper bed. But if you are a pauper patient, and most were, you are taken to a dormitory ward. The beds are crammed so close together, there is barely room to walk between them. In many asylums, patients who could not fit in beds slept on the floor or in the hallways. The bedding is thin, the rooms are unheated, and the person sleeping 6 inches from you might be experiencing a violent psychotic episode. This is your first night. You are cold, you are confused, and you are surrounded by people who are genuinely suffering. The attendants lock the ward doors from the outside. There is no call button. There is no emergency exit. If something goes wrong during the night, you wait until someone decides to check on you, and the sounds alone would keep you awake. The crying, the shouting, the constant murmuring of people lost in their own minds. One former patient at Hanwell Asylum described the experience of arriving as entering a region of living death, a place with no future to dream of and no peaceful past to remember. The smell is something no historical account quite prepares you for either. Dozens of unwashed bodies in an unventilated room, combined with the stench of chamber pots that were not always emptied regularly. Patients who were incontinent slept alongside everyone else. The sheets, if you had them, were shared and rarely washed, and the darkness was total. Victorian asylums did not leave candles or lamps burning in the wards overnight. Too much of a fire risk. So you lay there in complete blackness, listening to the sounds of suffering all around you, counting the hours until dawn. Now imagine waking up the next morning and realizing this is your life now. Because the daily routine inside a Victorian asylum was designed to do one thing above all else: maintain order, not heal you, not understand you, keep you quiet and keep you compliant. You are woken at 7 in the morning. Breakfast is tea or cocoa with porridge and bread. You eat in silence or near silence under the watch of attendants who have little to no training in mental health care. After breakfast, you are assigned work. If you are a man, you might be sent to the asylum farm to dig, plant, or harvest. If you are a woman, you are almost certainly going to the laundry. Victorian asylums tried to be self-sufficient, and patient labor was how they did it. You are not paid, you have no choice, and the work can last most of the day. The midday meal is served around 12:30. It is the largest meal of the day, but that is a relative term. The food in many asylums was barely edible. Nellie Bly, The journalist who went undercover in the Blackwell Island Asylum in 1887 described the bread as little more than dried dough, and the meat as so rotten it was nearly impossible to swallow. The water was dirty, and the same food, in roughly the same miserable quality, was served day after day after day. After dinner, there is a brief window for what the asylum calls recreation. For men, this might mean walking in an enclosed yard called an airing court. For women, it was often just sitting on hard wooden benches in a common room, not speaking, not moving, for hours at a stretch. Bly described patients being forced to sit still on these benches for 12 hours or more, with attendants yelling at anyone who shifted position or tried to talk. An early evening tea of bread and cake was served, and then you were sent to bed. The sedative paraldehyde, introduced into British clinical practice in 1882, was sometimes given to patients with their evening tea to keep them quiet through the night. Not because they needed it medically, because it made the staff's job easier. If you are enjoying this video and want to see more deep dives into dark history like this, hit that subscribe button. We cover stories like this every week. Now, the daily routine was grinding enough on its own. But the real horror of Victorian asylums was what happened when the routine failed. When a patient would not comply, would not stay quiet, would not sit still on those wooden benches. That is when the treatments came out. And I want to be clear about something. The doctors administering these treatments genuinely believed they were helping. Victorian medicine had almost no understanding of the brain, no concept of neurochemistry, and no effective psychiatric drugs. So they worked with what they had. And what they had was water, restraints, and a lot of bad theories. Hydrotherapy was one of the most common treatments, and it ranged from genuinely soothing to outright terrifying. On the gentle end, patients might be placed in a warm bath on a canvas hammock, covered with a sheet up to their chin, and left to soak for hours or even days. The water was kept at body temperature, continuously refreshed, and for some patients, this actually was calming. But on the other end of the spectrum, hydrotherapy became a weapon. Cold showers were blasted at patients from high-pressure hoses. Patients were wrapped in sheets, soaked in ice-cold water, a process some doctors called mummification. And then there was the bath of surprise, which was exactly what it sounds like. A patient would be seated in a chair rigged over a pool of freezing water and dropped in without warning. The shock was supposed to jolt them into lucidity. What it actually did was traumatize them further. Beyond water, there were restraints. Straitjackets were everywhere. Patients who were considered violent or disruptive could spend days locked inside one, unable to move their arms, unable to feed themselves, unable to scratch an itch on their own face. Some asylums used devices called tranquilizer chairs, which locked the patient into a seated position with straps across their chest, arms, and legs. The theory was that immobility would calm the mind. The reality was hours of agony, cramped muscles, and mounting panic. And then there was isolation. Padded cells were the Victorian answer to patients who could not be controlled by any other means. A small room, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, lined with thick padding on every surface. There was no furniture, no window, and no source of light. Patients could be confined in these cells for days or even weeks, with food pushed through a slot in the door. The stated purpose was to prevent self-harm. The actual effect was often devastating. Patients who entered padded cells with manageable conditions frequently emerged far worse than when they went in. The psychological damage of prolonged sensory deprivation was something Victorian doctors simply did not understand or, in many cases, did not care about. And then there were the drugs. Chloral hydrate and bromides were used to sedate patients, often in large doses and with no understanding of side effects or long-term consequences. Static electricity was applied to patients' heads. Injections of testicular fluids were tried as experimental cures. Some doctors even practiced surgery, including gynecological operations on women, under the theory that removing or repositioning reproductive organs could cure mental illness. A superintendent at an asylum in Ontario performed over 200 such surgeries on female patients in the 1890s and claimed a high success rate. The women, of course, had no say in the matter. All of this was considered legitimate medicine. All of it was approved by the medical establishment, and all of it happened behind locked doors, where no one from the outside could see. Which brings us to perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire Victorian Asylum story. A significant number of the people locked inside were not mentally ill at all. Victorian society had an incredibly broad and incredibly convenient definition of insanity. And it was not just the public asylums you had to worry about. The Victorian era also saw a booming trade in private madhouses. Wealthy families who wanted a troublesome relative to disappear could pay to have them locked away in one of these private facilities, where profit mattered far more than patient care. Some of these private asylums were essentially prisons with a medical license. In 1858, the Times of London published stories of multiple cases of wrongful confinement in private asylums, exposing just how easy it was for someone to be committed with almost no evidence of actual mental illness. Women were especially vulnerable. The patriarchal medical establishment of the Victorian era had turned female emotion into a disease. Women were committed for what doctors called hysteria, a diagnosis so vague it could mean anything from anxiety to sexual promiscuity to simply having a strong opinion. Women were committed for what was termed puerperal insanity, which we would recognize today as postpartum depression. Women were committed by their husbands for disobedience, for disagreeing with their religious beliefs, or for refusing to tolerate affairs. In one documented case, a man named Peter Mackenzie tried to have his wife Hannah committed after she objected to his adultery. He wanted to install his mistress as the head of the household, and the easiest way to remove his wife from the picture was to have a doctor declare her insane. Elizabeth Packard, a teacher and mother of 6 in Illinois, was committed to a state hospital by her husband because she disagreed with his views on religion. That was it. That was the entire basis for her commitment. And it was not just women. Immigrants who could not speak English were swept into asylums simply because no one could understand them. The poor were institutionalized because their families could not care for them, and there was nowhere else for them to go. Asylum records from this period are filled with admission reasons that have nothing to do with mental illness. Religious excitement, epilepsy, grief, poverty, laziness. Once you were inside, getting out was nearly impossible. There was no appeals process, no independent review, no advocate in your corner. Nellie Bly proved this firsthand. After just a few days in the Blackwell Island Asylum, she dropped her act entirely. She spoke normally, behaved normally, and repeatedly told the staff she was sane and wanted to leave. It did not matter. The more sanely she talked, the crazier the staff thought she was. She later wrote that the asylum was a human rat trap, easy to get in, but once there, impossible to get out. Bly's investigation in 1887 was a turning point. Working for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, the 23-year-old journalist took on an assignment that most reporters would have refused. Go undercover. Get yourself committed to an insane asylum. Survive it, and then write about what you saw. Bly checked into a boarding house for women in New York under the fake name Nellie Brown. She stayed up all night to give herself the wide-eyed, exhausted look of a disturbed person. She began accusing the other boarders of being insane and acting erratically enough that the house matron called the police. A judge examined her. A doctor examined her. Neither one spent much time on it. Within 3 days, Bly was on a boat headed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell Island, which is now Roosevelt Island in New York City. The asylum was built to hold about 1,000 patients. When Bly arrived, it was crammed with more than 1,600, overseen by just 16 doctors. For 10 days, Bly lived as a patient. She ate the rotten food. She endured the ice-cold baths, where attendants poured buckets of freezing water over her head while she shivered and gasped. The bath water was rarely changed between patients, meaning dozens of women bathed in the same filthy water. Even the towels were shared. Patients with skin conditions, boils, or open sores would dry themselves with a towel, and the next patient in line was handed the same one. She sat on the hard benches for hours without moving. She watched nurses berate and beat patients who complained. She saw women tied together with ropes and forced to pull carts like animals. And she talked to the other patients. Many of them were not mentally ill. They were immigrants who spoke no English and could not explain themselves to the doctors. They were women who had simply fallen on hard times, with no family to support them and no social safety net to catch them. Bly realized that even the patients who arrived at the asylum perfectly sane were being driven mad by the conditions inside it. The treatments were making people worse, not better. When Bly's articles were published, they caused an immediate sensation. A grand jury launched its own investigation, confirming her findings. The budget for the Department of Public Charities and Corrections was increased by nearly $1 million, which is roughly $24 million in today's money. Abusive staff were fired. Translators were hired for immigrant patients. New procedures were put in place to prevent sane people from being wrongfully committed. But Bly's investigation only exposed one asylum in one city. Across England, across the United States, across much of the Western world, the same pattern was playing out. Asylums that started with genuine humanitarian ideals were collapsing under the weight of too many patients, too little money, and a medical profession that had no real tools to treat mental illness. The British government had tried to create Oversight. The Lunacy Act of 1845 established commissioners in lunacy to inspect both public and private asylums. But inspections were infrequent, often announced in advance, and easily gamed. When Bly's investigation prompted a grand jury visit to Blackwell Island, the asylum scrambled to clean itself up. Fresh food was brought in. The wards were scrubbed down. Patients who had given Bly details about their abuse were transferred or released before the investigators arrived. The system was built to protect itself, not the people inside it. By the end of the 19th century, the optimism that had defined the early asylum movement was completely gone. Hanwell Asylum in London, which had once been celebrated as a model of humane treatment, was described in 1893 as having gloomy corridors, an absence of decoration, and a general atmosphere of decay. The personalized moral treatment that reformers had championed had been replaced by mass confinement, chemical sedation, and the routine use of padded cells and restraint devices. Superintendents who had once dreamed of curing mental illness were now focused on a much simpler goal: keeping the patients alive and keeping them quiet. The numbers tell the story on their own. In England, the asylum population grew steadily through the entire 19th century. Whether this was because mental illness was actually increasing or because society was simply becoming less tolerant of people who did not fit in, historians still debate. But the result was the same. Facilities, designed for hundreds, were holding thousands. One doctor might be responsible for hundreds of patients. Staff were undertrained, overworked, and in many cases, outright abusive. And here is what makes all of this relevant, even now. The Victorian asylum system did not just disappear. Its echoes shaped mental health care for over a century. The large institutional model, the idea that the mentally ill should be separated from society and housed in remote facilities, persisted well into the 20th century. Many of the same buildings that opened during Queen Victoria's reign continued to operate as psychiatric hospitals into the 1960s and 70s. Some were not fully closed until the 1990s. The treatments changed. The restraints got more sophisticated. The drugs got more targeted. But the fundamental architecture of the system, both the physical buildings and the philosophy behind them, survived far longer than anyone would like to admit. And the fundamental tension at the heart of the Victorian asylum has never really been resolved. The gap between what society says it wants to do for the mentally ill and what it is actually willing to pay for. That gap was there in 1850, and it is there today. The Victorian reformers were not evil people. They genuinely wanted to help, but they built a system that could not scale, refused to fund it properly, and then looked the other way when it started to fall apart. So when we ask why you would not survive one night in a Victorian asylum, the answer is not just about the cold baths or the straitjackets or the rotten food. It is about something deeper. These were places where your identity was erased, your autonomy was taken, your voice was ignored, and every aspect of your existence was controlled by people who had almost no understanding of what was actually wrong with you. And in many cases, nothing was wrong with you at all. You were just inconvenient. You were just poor. You were just a woman who talked back. The buildings are mostly gone now, demolished or converted into luxury apartments, which is its own kind of dark irony. But the questions they raised about how societies treat their most vulnerable members are still very much alive. We like to think we have moved past all of this, that modern psychiatry is fundamentally different from what happened in those wards. And in many ways, it is. But the instinct to warehouse people we do not understand, to underfund the systems meant to help them, to look away when conditions deteriorate behind closed doors, that instinct has not gone anywhere. The Victorian Asylum was a mirror, and what it reflected was not just the cruelty of a particular era, it was the gap between what we say we believe and what we are willing to do about it. If this video opened your eyes to something you did not know before, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. We have more stories like this coming soon.